A luxury seat. A cruel mistake. A nightmare that turns into the ultimate reckoning. When Charlotte Monroe, a high-profile executive, takes her first-class seat, she expects professionalism, respect, and a smooth flight. Instead, she's met with something far worse: deliberate humiliation, whispered mockery, and a crew determined to erase her presence. But what happens when the woman they try to degrade is the very person who holds their future in her hands? What starts as a routine flight becomes a ruthless battle for justice, a corporate scandal in the making, and a brutal lesson in power. By the time this plane lands, careers will be destroyed, reputations shattered, and those who thought they were untouchable will finally learn what it means to be powerless. How far should justice go? What would you do in Charlotte's place? Comment your thoughts below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you love stories of power, downfall, and the ultimate revenge, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning. How much humiliation can a person endure before they break? The air inside JFK International Airport was thick with the usual chaos. Boarding calls echoing overhead, the rhythmic hum of suitcase wheels rolling across polished floors, and the low murmur of travelers immersed in their own hurried worlds. Charlotte Monroe stood at the first-class boarding line, adjusting the strap of her leather handbag. Dressed in an immaculate navy blue pantsuit, she was the picture of quiet sophistication. Yet, experience had long taught her that appearances did not always grant respect. As she stepped forward, the gate agent, a middle-aged blonde woman with sharp features, took her boarding pass. The woman hesitated, just for a split second, her gaze flicking between Charlotte and the name printed on the ticket. The hesitation was barely perceptible, but Charlotte noticed. She always noticed. The woman's professional smile returned, practiced but hollow. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Monroe," she said, her tone clipped. Charlotte nodded once, stepping forward without another word. The moment she entered the first-class cabin, she felt it. The shift. Conversations softened, stolen glances lingered, expressions grew unreadable. The usual energy of an exclusive world, where comfort and privilege intertwined, seemed to falter for just a breath as she took her seat. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. But then came the voice. Didn't know they were letting just anyone into first class these days. Charlotte didn't turn. She knew exactly where the words came from. Charles Whitmore. Seated in 3A, the man was in his mid-50s, dressed in an impeccable designer suit, his salt and pepper hair slicked back. He smirked as he scrolled through his tablet, the insult hanging in the air between them like a foul stench. Charlotte exhaled slowly through her nose and continued to her seat, 2B, next to a man with auburn hair, scribbling in a leather-bound journal. "Liam Carter," he introduced himself as she settled in. His tone was polite, neutral. Charlotte nodded once, fastening her seatbelt. She knew what would come next. Jessica Langley, the lead flight attendant, began moving through the aisle, distributing menus to passengers one by one. She did so with the ease of someone who had done this routine hundreds of times, offering polite small talk, an extra smile here, a brief conversation there. When she reached Charlotte's row, she did not stop. No hesitation. No explanation. Just a simple, deliberate exclusion. Charlotte's gaze didn't waver, but she took note. Minutes passed. The scent of freshly plated meals wafted through the air. Trays were placed delicately before each passenger, wine glasses filled with deep red liquid, every plate meticulously arranged for presentation. Then, Jessica returned. "We only have one option left," she said, her voice clipped. "Chicken or vegetarian. No apology. No acknowledgement." Charlotte's eyes flicked down to her tray as it was placed before her. Unlike the polished dishes served to other passengers, hers looked haphazardly thrown together. The sauce pooled to one side, a missing bread roll, an afterthought rather than a meal. Across the aisle, Charles let out a low chuckle. "You should be grateful. Some people don't even get served." Charlotte didn't respond. She picked up her fork. She ate. The low hum of the aircraft engines blended with the hushed chatter of first-class passengers, the gentle clinking of cutlery against fine china, and the subdued laughter of those enjoying the exclusivity of their elevated status. Charlotte Monroe sat motionless in seat 2B, her posture composed, her face a mask of impassivity. The barely perceptible weight of the previous insults, subtle yet searing, lingered in the air around her, but she gave no sign of acknowledgement. She had learned, long ago, that reacting only fed their satisfaction. Jessica Langley's presence was impossible to ignore. The lead flight attendant floated effortlessly between passengers, her tone shifting seamlessly from warm hospitality to detached professionalism depending on who she was addressing. Charlotte watched as Jessica refilled wine glasses with an indulgent smile, adjusting a gentleman's napkin with feigned affection. And yet, when she passed Charlotte's seat, it was as if she wasn't there. The avoidance was intentional, deliberate. "Excuse me," a voice murmured beside Charlotte. It was Liam Carter, the auburn-haired journalist, his eyes darting toward Jessica's retreating figure. His fingers rested on the stem of his wine glass, hesitating. "You didn't get a menu earlier, did you?" Charlotte glanced at him but said nothing. She knew what he was implying. He had noticed. Liam exhaled through his nose, his gaze contemplative. "Interesting," he mused, before taking a slow sip of his wine. He didn't push further, but his awareness hung between them like an unspoken truth. Moments later, the clatter of a service cart approached. Another flight attendant, this one younger, brunette, with softer features, pushed the cart forward. Sophie Grant. Charlotte remembered her name from the badge pinned neatly to her uniform. Jessica appeared again, leading the meal service. "Would you care for another glass, Mr. Whitmore?" she cooed, pausing at 3A. Charles Whitmore barely acknowledged her as he tilted his glass forward, his attention still fixed on the tablet in his lap. She chuckled lightly at something he didn't say. Then she turned and locked eyes with Sophie. The brunette hesitated. Charlotte knew that look. It was the silent command of hierarchy, Jessica's quiet assertion of control. Sophie shifted her weight, gripping the edge of the cart tighter, her expression conflicted. Jessica smiled. "You don't need to bother with her," she said lightly, just loud enough for Charlotte to hear. Sophie's jaw tensed, but she nodded. Without hesitation, Jessica moved on, bypassing Charlotte completely. The sound of plates landing gently in front of the other passengers filled the air. Each meal arrived on a pristine tray, meticulously arranged, exuding an air of exclusivity and indulgence. A sharp clunk landed in front of Charlotte. Jessica had placed her tray down with none of the finesse she had shown the others. The movement was just forceful enough to seem careless, just controlled enough to be intentional. Charlotte looked down at the dish. It was the same meal as before, chicken in a cream sauce, but something was off. The sauce was uneven, smeared across the plate. The vegetables looked limp, as though they had been left sitting too long. The bread roll was missing entirely. She could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air. "Be grateful you got anything at all." Across the aisle, Charles let out a low chuckle. "Attention to detail really makes a difference, doesn't it?" he muttered, swirling his wine. Charlotte picked up her fork. She ate. The flight continued its quiet hum. The murmur of conversations, the occasional chime of service calls, the sound of shifting fabric as passengers adjusted themselves for comfort. But for Charlotte, the weight of exclusion settled deeper, heavier. Jessica passed by multiple times after that, each time tending to other passengers while acting as though Charlotte was invisible. Not an afterthought. A non-entity. At one point, a flight attendant approached with a steaming cup of coffee. She stopped at Charles's row first, offering him a polite nod as she placed his cup before him. Then, she turned to Liam. "Would you like anything, sir?" "I'm fine," Liam said absently, still scribbling notes in his journal. The attendant nodded, stepping forward, then hesitated, her gaze flicking toward Charlotte's empty tray table. The hesitation lasted only a second before she moved past her without a word. The tray remained empty. The message was clear. Charlotte wasn't meant to receive anything unless she asked, unless she demanded, unless she fought. And even then, there were no guarantees. She exhaled quietly, folding her hands in her lap. She had endured worse. This was nothing. Jessica strolled past once more, pausing briefly at Charlotte's row, tilting her head slightly, as if studying an abstract piece of art she found vaguely unappealing. "You seem awfully quiet, Ms. Monroe." It wasn't a question. It was an observation laced with an expectation, a taunt. Charlotte met Jessica's gaze evenly but said nothing. Jessica's smile stretched. Satisfied. With that, she turned away. Charlotte resumed staring straight ahead, expression unreadable, hands folded neatly over her lap as the world around her moved on, indifferent to her presence. The cabin of first class had settled into a rhythm of quiet indulgence, the kind only afforded to the wealthy. Crystal glasses clinked softly, cutlery met porcelain in gentle, refined movements, and hushed conversations drifted through the air like smoke. Charlotte Monroe sat perfectly still in seat 2B, her hands folded neatly on her lap. The weight of exclusion was no longer subtle. It was a presence, a tangible force pressing down on her. She had learned to endure. But endurance did not mean oblivion. The smirks, the glances, the way conversations shifted whenever she was within earshot, none of it escaped her notice. Jessica Langley moved through the aisle like a hostess at an exclusive event, her demeanor effortless, practiced. Every passenger received a warm touch on the shoulder, a lean-in whisper, an extra smile. Everyone, except Charlotte. She did not even glance in her direction. It was deliberate. Charlotte turned her attention toward the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds outside, allowing herself the illusion of distance. She could feel the shift in atmosphere before she even looked up. Jessica had returned. She was at Charles Whitmore's seat. The man had barely looked at Charlotte when she first boarded, aside from his condescending remark. Now, with a smirk that reeked of entitlement, he made a show of stretching before turning toward Jessica. "You know, I was just thinking, some standards should really be enforced more strictly." Jessica let out a polite laugh. "Oh, what do you mean, Mr. Whitmore?" Charles tilted his head slightly, his eyes glinting with unspoken amusement. "Well, when you pay for first class, you expect a certain level of atmosphere." The words were laced with meaning. Jessica played along, her expression carefully neutral. "Of course, sir. We do our best to ensure the highest quality experience for our most valued guests." Her most valued guests. Charlotte did not react. But she wasn't the only one listening. Liam Carter, the journalist beside her, paused in his writing. He glanced up from his notebook, gaze flicking between Jessica and Charles. His expression remained unreadable, but Charlotte could sense the tension in his posture. Jessica, however, carried on as though Charlotte did not exist. When she returned to meal service, the tray she placed in front of Charlotte was worse than before. The presentation was even sloppier than the first meal. The plate had grease stains along the rim, the silverware was placed haphazardly, and the portion was noticeably smaller. Jessica did not say a word as she placed it down. Charlotte stared at the tray for a long moment before simply picking up her fork. She ate. Across the aisle, Charles let out another quiet chuckle. "I suppose some people are used to less," he mused, swirling his wine. Jessica smiled, not correcting him. No one corrected him. That was the real insult. Not just the words, not just the treatment, but the silent acceptance of it all. The quiet, complicit approval. As the flight continued, the message became clearer with every passing hour. Charlotte was meant to feel out of place, and they were succeeding. The atmosphere in first class had shifted from mere exclusion to something heavier, something more intentional. Charlotte Monroe had felt the weight of subtle humiliation before, but now it was morphing into outright hostility. Jessica Langley no longer ignored Charlotte out of indifference. It was now an active choice. Her service to other passengers had become exaggerated, almost theatrical. When she approached Charles Whitmore's seat, she laughed at his offhand jokes, refilled his wine before the glass was even half empty, and lingered in conversation, ensuring he had everything he could possibly need. The same treatment extended to nearly everyone around Charlotte, except her. When Jessica walked by Charlotte's row, she would pass with a carefully blank expression, her hands always full, always appearing too busy to notice Charlotte's presence. The moment was always brief, but Charlotte recognized what it was. A performance. Jessica wanted everyone to see it. To see how effortlessly she dismissed Charlotte. To see how easily she could pretend she wasn't there at all. Charlotte, as always, said nothing. The flight dragged on, the suffocating tension mounting. Passengers who had once stolen glances at Charlotte now openly observed her treatment with curiosity, but not concern. No one spoke up. No one asked questions. Except for one person. Liam Carter had been watching. The journalist beside her had made no effort to hide his awareness. He had not intervened, nor had he engaged, but he was taking notes. Charlotte saw the way his fingers moved across the pages of his journal. He wasn't simply jotting thoughts. He was documenting. Then, the next wave of degradation arrived. Jessica appeared again, standing at the front of first class, clearing her throat loudly enough to demand attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice sweet but firm, "as we continue our service, we'd like to ensure everyone is as comfortable as possible. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Her gaze flickered past Charlotte as she continued. "If anyone feels inconvenienced in any way, do let me know. We want to ensure first class remains an exclusive and comfortable experience for all our valued passengers." A deliberate phrasing. A calculated tone. Charlotte could feel the eyes turning toward her, the weight of unspoken words settling like a stone in her chest. Then came the final insult. A different flight attendant, one Charlotte hadn't seen before, approached. She was younger than Jessica, her expression more hesitant, but she still carried the same quiet confidence of someone who knew who belonged and who didn't. "Miss," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I need to ask, are you certain you're seated in the right section?" For the first time since boarding, Charlotte turned her head, meeting the woman's gaze. She didn't frown. She didn't narrow her eyes. She simply looked at her. The flight attendant hesitated, then quickly added, "It's just that, we've had passengers mistakenly take the wrong seat before." The meaning was clear. "You don't belong here." Across the aisle, Charles let out a quiet chuckle, sipping his wine. Someone else murmured something Charlotte couldn't quite hear, but the tone was unmistakable: amusement. Charlotte didn't answer. She didn't move. She simply turned back toward the window. The attendant lingered, uncertain, before shuffling away. Charlotte exhaled slowly. She could endure this. She had endured worse. But the storm was forming, and they had no idea who they were trying to erase. The air in first class had become suffocating. It was no longer just exclusion. It was no longer just whispered comments or lingering stares. Now, it was an unspoken agreement. Charlotte Monroe sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her lap, her expression unreadable. But she could feel it, the shift, the weight of shared amusement at her expense. Jessica Langley no longer avoided her. She enjoyed this now. The lead flight attendant glided through the aisle with the air of a performer, her every movement calculated for effect. Each time she passed Charlotte, she would pause. Just slightly, just long enough for those around them to see. And then she would move on, her silence more pointed than any insult. Across the aisle, Charles Whitmore leaned back in his seat, swirling his wine, his smirk never quite leaving his lips. The way he watched Jessica, the way he observed Charlotte's stillness, it was a game to him. Then, Jessica struck. "Oh, Mr. Whitmore," she said, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "I do apologize if today's service isn't up to our usual standards. We try to maintain a certain level of quality here in first class, but..." Her gaze flickered briefly toward Charlotte before she sighed dramatically. "Sometimes things slip through the cracks." A soft chuckle rippled through the cabin. Charlotte said nothing. Jessica smiled, adjusting her posture, basking in the attention. "Of course," she continued, "we do our best to accommodate everyone, regardless of circumstances." Another laugh. Jessica turned, making her way back down the aisle. But before she left, she did something new. Something worse. She dropped a used napkin onto Charlotte's tray. Not forcefully, not aggressively, just carelessly enough for it to look unintentional. Charlotte stared at the crumpled fabric resting beside her untouched utensils. Someone, a passenger, stifled a laugh. Jessica didn't even look back. For the first time, Charlotte felt the smallest tremor of exhaustion in her bones. Not anger, not humiliation, just tiredness. She reached forward, took the napkin between her fingers, and set it aside. She resumed her stillness. And yet, they continued. The meal service concluded. Jessica never refilled Charlotte's drink. When the dessert course came, her tray was the only one left empty. No words were exchanged. No questions were asked. Charlotte simply sat, waiting for the flight to end. But it wasn't over. Jessica returned once more, this time with an expression of exaggerated concern. "Ms. Monroe," she said, voice dripping with false sweetness, "I just wanted to check. Are you feeling okay? I noticed you haven't eaten much." She tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "Or perhaps first-class dining isn't what you're used to?" Laughter. Louder this time. Charlotte looked up. For the first time, she met Jessica's gaze. Jessica held it, waiting, daring her. Charlotte did not react. She simply blinked, slowly, before turning back toward the window. Jessica's lips twitched. She took a step back, her satisfaction palpable. "Let me know if you need anything, dear," she said softly, before walking away. The laughter lingered even after she left. And Charlotte sat in silence, staring out at the endless sky. She had endured worse. She would endure this too. For now, there was no more pretense. Charlotte Monroe had spent the past few hours enduring whispered comments, lingering stares, and subtle exclusions. But now, the game had changed. Jessica Langley was done playing in the shadows. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. A quiet, expectant tension filled the first-class cabin, as if every passenger sensed something was coming. Conversations had softened, laughter had turned into knowing glances, and the usual hum of travel had taken on a different rhythm, one laced with anticipation. Charlotte sat in perfect stillness. She had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of power. But Jessica was determined to take that away from her. The flight attendant moved with an air of careful calculation, stopping just short of Charlotte's row. She cleared her throat, just loud enough to gather attention, before speaking in her sweetest, most professional tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jessica began, her voice carrying easily over the subdued noise of the cabin. "As always, we strive to provide the highest level of service to our valued first-class passengers." Her smile was practiced, polished, and utterly insincere. Charlotte knew what was coming. Jessica continued, her eyes flickering toward Charlotte for the briefest of moments before she turned her gaze to the rest of the cabin. "That being said, we understand that, on occasion, passengers may find themselves in a seating arrangement that is unexpected." The words dripped with thinly veiled amusement. A murmur rippled through the rows. A quiet chuckle. Jessica smiled wider. "To ensure that all of our guests receive the service they deserve, we'd like to extend a special courtesy check for anyone who may have mistakenly ended up in the wrong section of the plane." The laughter grew louder. Charlotte did not move. Across the aisle, Charles Whitmore smirked, his fingers idly tracing the rim of his wine glass. He turned to Jessica, his voice carrying just enough amusement to fan the flames. "That's a fantastic idea," he mused. "Wouldn't want standards to slip, after all." Jessica's expression didn't change, but Charlotte could feel her satisfaction radiating through the air. She had set the trap. And now, she was waiting. Waiting for Charlotte to react. Waiting for her to break. Waiting for her to give them the show they wanted. But Charlotte had spent years perfecting the art of restraint. She remained utterly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze focused straight ahead. The silence stretched. Jessica hesitated, just slightly. Charlotte saw it. For a single second, the mask almost slipped. Jessica had expected more. She had expected anger, a protest, a demand, something. But Charlotte gave her nothing. The moment passed. Jessica's smile twitched before she recovered. "Well," she said, her voice still syrupy sweet, "I'm glad we're all comfortable where we are." She turned on her heel, walking away as though she had just delivered a casual announcement, as though she had not just humiliated someone in front of an entire cabin. But the damage had been done. Charlotte could feel it in the air. The shift. A permission had been granted. It wasn't just Jessica anymore. The passengers had joined in. She could hear them. The whispers, the half-hidden smirks, the knowing glances exchanged between those who felt they were on the right side of this unwritten hierarchy. A man behind her muttered something under his breath, just loud enough for his seatmate to hear. A woman 2 rows ahead stole a glance over her shoulder before turning back with a quiet shake of her head. The agreement was unspoken. Charlotte was meant to feel out of place. She was meant to understand that no one here considered her an equal. And that was when the final blow landed. Jessica returned, this time with a clipboard in hand. She leaned down slightly, just enough to make her presence feel intrusive. "I'm so sorry to bother you, Ms. Monroe," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "But there seems to be a small issue with your booking." The whisper of a hush fell over the cabin. Charlotte knew what was happening. Jessica wasn't actually questioning her ticket. She was questioning her right to be here. And everyone was watching, waiting. Jessica tilted her head. "Would you mind just confirming your seat number for me?" Across the aisle, Charles grinned into his drink. Jessica had just elevated the game. Now, it wasn't just a humiliation. It was an accusation. Charlotte slowly turned her head and met Jessica's gaze for the first time since this flight had begun. Jessica's smile never faltered, but Charlotte saw it. The slight flicker of anticipation in her eyes. She was waiting for Charlotte to defend herself. She was waiting for Charlotte to make a scene. But Charlotte did not break. She simply held Jessica's gaze for a single deliberate second, before turning her attention back to the window. Jessica waited. Then, slowly, she straightened. She hadn't won. Not entirely. But she had made her move. And the rest of the plane had seen it. As Jessica walked away, Charlotte remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She had endured worse. She would endure this too. For now. Charlotte Monroe knew what was coming. It had been building for hours, festering beneath the surface of polite cruelty and thinly veiled condescension. The whispers had grown bolder, the laughter less restrained. Jessica Langley had orchestrated the humiliation carefully, ensuring that each slight against Charlotte was met with approval or indifference. She had turned the first-class cabin into an audience, and Charlotte was the performance they were all too eager to watch. And now, it was time for the finale. Jessica returned, this time with purpose. She didn't linger at the front of the cabin like before. She didn't feign an announcement or mask her intentions under the guise of customer service. This time, she went straight for Charlotte. The murmurs died down. The air shifted. Charlotte felt the weight of every gaze fixated on her. Jessica stopped beside her seat, clipboard in hand, her expression perfectly neutral. Too neutral. "Ms. Monroe," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to make it clear that this was not a request. "I need you to come with me." Silence. Jessica waited. Charlotte didn't move. Jessica tilted her head, feigning patience. "I understand this might be inconvenient, but I'm going to have to ask you to step to the front of the cabin. Now." Liam Carter, the journalist beside her, frowned. His pen, which had been moving steadily across the pages of his notebook, paused mid-stroke. Charlotte heard the rustle of shifting bodies, the way people leaned in, eager to see what would happen next. Across the aisle, Charles Whitmore smirked. He leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head as if watching a show reach its climax. Jessica didn't waver. Charlotte remained still. Then Jessica made her move. With exaggerated sympathy, she sighed. "Ms. Monroe, I really didn't want it to come to this, but," she turned, loud enough for everyone to hear, "since you've refused to cooperate, I'm afraid I'll have to call the captain and request security to assist." A collective murmur swept through the cabin. Jessica had played her trump card. Charlotte had been reduced from a guest to a problem. She could hear it, the shift in perception. Passengers who had ignored her now viewed her as a disruption, as someone who was causing trouble, someone who needed to be removed. Jessica knew exactly what she was doing. Charlotte finally moved. She slowly turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto Jessica's. Jessica didn't flinch. She held her ground, her grip tightening around the clipboard, as if ready to use it as a shield. The silence stretched. Then, a voice broke it. "She's not causing any trouble." "Liam." Jessica's head snapped toward him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look up from his notebook. But his words cut through the air like a blade. Jessica smiled, but it was tight, forced. "Excuse me." Liam turned a page. "I said," he repeated, deliberately slow, "she's not causing trouble. She hasn't moved. She hasn't spoken. You're the only one escalating the situation." Jessica laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "Sir, this is a private matter." Liam didn't respond. He simply continued writing. Charlotte could feel the shift again. This time, a different kind. Jessica wasn't in control anymore. For the first time, someone had challenged her. It was small, subtle, but enough. Jessica knew it too. Her jaw tensed. "I'm following protocol, Mr. Carter. If she refuses to move, I'll be forced to." "Oh, for God's sake," Charles interrupted, his voice carrying a note of irritation. "Enough of this." Jessica turned instantly, her eyes lighting up. This was what she wanted. Charles leaned forward, setting his glass down with a deliberate clink. "This flight is already unbearable enough without this distraction." A few passengers murmured in agreement. Jessica jumped on the opportunity. "I completely understand, Mr. Whitmore. That's why I'm handling the issue now." Issue. Not person. Not passenger. Issue. Jessica smiled, turning back to Charlotte. "Ms. Monroe, are you going to comply, or will I have to escalate this further?" The final blow. Charlotte had been placed into a no-win scenario. If she moved, she would be confirming that she had done something wrong. If she refused, she would be proving Jessica's point, that she was a disruption that needed to be handled. She had been cornered. Charlotte exhaled slowly. She reached for the armrest, her movements calm, controlled, deliberate. She stood. Jessica's smile widened in victory. Charlotte stepped out of her seat. And then she walked past Jessica without a word. Without looking at her. Without acknowledging her. Jessica blinked. For a moment, she seemed caught off guard, as if the reaction she had planned for had been replaced with something she didn't anticipate. Charlotte walked to the front of the cabin. Jessica hesitated, but then quickly followed, her composure snapping back into place. She had won. The passengers watched with satisfaction as Charlotte disappeared from view. Behind her, whispers filled the space she had left behind. Jessica turned back toward the cabin, smoothing down her uniform. Her eyes flickered toward Charles. He raised his glass slightly, nodding in approval. Jessica smiled. Charlotte Monroe had been put in her place. Or so they thought. Charlotte Monroe walked away in silence. The whispers followed her. Every step she took toward the front of the first-class cabin was met with hushed voices, amused glances, and barely concealed satisfaction. She had been removed, dismissed, erased. Jessica Langley watched her go, her smile barely contained. Charles Whitmore leaned back in his seat, his smirk widening as he took another sip of his wine. To them, this was victory. Charlotte reached the galley area, where another flight attendant, a younger woman named Sophie Grant, stood awkwardly, her hands gripping a tablet. She looked uncertain, nervous. She had witnessed everything. She knew what had just happened, and yet, she said nothing. Charlotte stopped beside her, turning slightly. "May I use the phone?" Her voice was quiet, calm. Sophie hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit door. I'm not sure if..." Charlotte didn't argue. She simply reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and pulled out a sleek, black business card. She placed it in Sophie's hand. Sophie glanced down. Then her eyes widened. Her fingers trembled slightly as she looked back up at Charlotte. "You." Charlotte gave her a small, patient nod. Sophie swallowed hard. Then, without another word, she stepped aside. Charlotte reached for the crew phone. Back in the first-class cabin, Jessica was basking in the attention. A few passengers murmured their approval, quietly praising her for maintaining standards. One man even offered a toast to proper service. Jessica smiled, feigning humility. "I just want to make sure our valued customers receive the experience they paid for," she said smoothly. Charles let out a soft chuckle. "And you handled that beautifully." Jessica glowed. Then, the intercom chimed. The voice that followed was not the captain's. It was Charlotte's. "This is Charlotte Monroe." The entire cabin froze. Jessica's smile vanished. "I'd like to personally thank the staff on this flight for their hospitality," Charlotte continued, her voice calm but unwavering, "and for providing a perfect first-hand example of the precise issue I've spent the last year working to eliminate." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Jessica went pale. Charles stiffened. Passengers exchanged confused glances. Liam Carter, the journalist, didn't look surprised at all. Instead, he smirked. Charlotte continued. "For those of you who don't recognize my name, allow me to introduce myself properly. Charlotte Monroe, Executive Director of Aviation Ethics and Inclusion, and Senior Consultant to the CEO of this airline." The cabin erupted in gasps. Jessica staggered back, her face draining of color. Charlotte wasn't a nobody. She wasn't just another passenger. She was one of the most powerful figures overseeing the airline's entire ethical policy. And Jessica had just humiliated her in front of an entire first-class cabin. Charlotte's voice remained smooth, controlled. "I was scheduled to meet with the airline's CEO tomorrow to discuss ongoing concerns regarding customer experience and discrimination policies. But it seems," she paused, her tone sharpening just slightly, "I've already found my case study." Jessica's knees almost buckled. Charles set down his wine glass, his expression darkening. The whispers returned, but now they were frantic. Passengers were no longer amused. They were uneasy, afraid, because now, the person they had laughed at, ignored, and openly humiliated, was the one with the power to ruin them. Charlotte's next words sealed their fate. "This flight will land in approximately 1 hour," she said, her voice taking on the same detached professionalism Jessica had used against her earlier. "I will be meeting with the airline's leadership immediately upon arrival." Jessica gripped the back of a seat for support. As for the crew and passengers who have participated in, encouraged, or remained complicit in the events of this flight, Charlotte let the silence stretch. Let them feel the weight of it. Then, finally, her verdict. "We'll be having a very important discussion." The intercom clicked off, and hell began. Chaos. Pure, unfiltered chaos. The moment Charlotte Monroe's voice faded from the intercom, the illusion of control shattered. The first-class cabin, which had once been filled with smug superiority and laughter, was now an echo chamber of panic. Jessica Langley stood frozen in place, her hands gripping the back of a seat as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her breathing had become shallow, erratic. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking like a woman on the verge of collapse. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She turned sharply, searching for someone, anyone to back her up. But there was no support. Passengers who had once smirked along with her now refused to meet her gaze. The amusement that had filled the cabin had turned to dread. Across the aisle, Charles Whitmore was deathly silent. His fingers, which had once idly traced the rim of his wine glass, were now clenched into a fist. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, his body stiff. Jessica had never seen him like this. Charles Whitmore was a man who owned boardrooms, who commanded authority with nothing but a glance. A man who had always gotten away with everything. But not this time. This time, he wasn't in control. And neither was she. A sharp chime from the overhead speakers made Jessica flinch. Then, a new voice filled the cabin. "This is Captain Reynolds," the voice announced, calm and composed. "We have been made aware of a serious incident occurring on this flight." Jessica's stomach dropped. The captain was getting involved? "We have received direct instructions from corporate leadership regarding the matter," Reynolds continued. "Effective immediately, crew members involved in misconduct will be relieved of duty for the remainder of the flight." Murmurs of shock rippled through the passengers. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. No, 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 no. This includes lead flight attendant Jessica Langley. The words hit her like a physical blow. A fresh wave of whispers crashed over the cabin. Jessica felt all eyes on her, but this time, it wasn't admiration. It was disgust. Her hands clenched. "You can't," she started, but the captain's voice cut through her protest. "A senior investigator from corporate will be waiting upon landing," he continued. "All passengers and crew involved in the reported incident will be required to remain for questioning." Jessica staggered back. Senior investigator? This wasn't just a warning. This was a formal investigation. Her career was over. Charles finally spoke. "This is absurd," he snapped, pushing himself up in his seat. "You people are overreacting." But his voice, normally so commanding, so filled with authority, wavered. For the first time, Charles Whitmore sounded afraid. Jessica latched onto that. She turned to him, desperate. "Mr. Whitmore, they can't do this. I suggest," a calm, dangerous voice interrupted. "You both sit down." Liam Carter. The journalist had barely spoken throughout the entire flight. He had watched, observed, written everything down in his journal. Now he closed it with a soft thud and stared directly at them. "You still don't get it, do you?" His voice was quiet, but razor sharp. "This isn't just a minor inconvenience. This isn't a slap on the wrist." Jessica's hands shook. Liam leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You humiliated the wrong person." Silence. Jessica felt her chest tighten, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Charles gritted his teeth. "I have connections. I can." Liam smiled. It wasn't friendly. "Your connections won't save you this time." Then, as if the universe itself had decided to prove his point, another voice cut through the tension. Mr. Whitmore, a new flight attendant, one Jessica didn't even recognize, stood beside him, her face stiff with professionalism. "We have just received a direct request from our CEO." Charles stilled. The words "direct request from our CEO" were not ones he was used to hearing against him. Jessica's knees nearly gave out. Not just an investigator. Not just a captain's report. The CEO himself was personally involved. The flight attendant held out a printed document, her expression unreadable. "You are hereby notified that upon landing, your elite membership status with the airline will be permanently revoked." Gasps filled the cabin. Jessica felt like she was going to throw up. Charles looked stunned. His mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to argue, but no words came out. Then, the final nail in the coffin. The flight attendant turned to Jessica. "And as for you, Ms. Langley," she hesitated before handing over her own document. Jessica took it with numb fingers. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines. And then she saw it. Termination of employment. Effective immediately. The world tilted. Jessica tried to breathe, but the walls were closing in. Her career, her entire life, gone. Because of one woman. Charlotte Monroe. Jessica's vision blurred. She turned, desperate, searching for someone to help her. But no one met her eyes. She had laughed with these passengers. She had entertained them, served them, humiliated Charlotte for them. And now, they were looking at her the same way they had looked at Charlotte. Like she didn't belong here. Like she was nothing. Jessica sank into the nearest empty seat, her head spinning. Charles sat down heavily beside her, his entire body rigid with fury and humiliation. And then, the final blow. Liam let out a quiet chuckle. "I hope you enjoyed the show," he murmured. Jessica felt sick, because she realized, too late, that the performance had never been Charlotte's. It had been hers. And now, she was the punchline. The plane landed in complete silence. No applause. No chatter. Just an unbearable, suffocating weight hanging in the air. The first-class cabin, once filled with smug laughter and whispered mockery, now felt like a courtroom before sentencing. Charlotte Monroe stood first. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, collected her handbag, and stepped into the aisle with complete composure. Every movement was deliberate, every step a reminder of who held the power now. Jessica Langley didn't move. She sat frozen in her seat, staring at nothing, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The printed termination notice still lay on her tray table, as if she couldn't bring herself to touch it again. Across the aisle, Charles Whitmore seethed in silence. His fingers tapped restlessly against the armrest, his face rigid, but his eyes betrayed his panic. He wasn't used to this. Losing wasn't something he understood. The flight attendants avoided looking at Charlotte as she walked toward the front of the plane. Even those who hadn't participated in the humiliation remained silent, as if hoping their inaction would be forgotten. It wouldn't be. Sophie Grant, the young attendant who had hesitated when Charlotte had asked for the crew phone, stood near the cockpit door. Her eyes flickered toward Charlotte, filled with something almost like regret. Charlotte said nothing to her. The doors opened. The sight awaiting them at the gate was nothing short of poetic justice. A team of airline officials stood waiting, along with a senior investigator wearing a crisp suit, a badge clipped to his lapel. Beside him, Jonathan Marks, the airline CEO. Jessica inhaled sharply. Charles went completely still. Jonathan's gaze swept across the passengers as they filed out. When he saw Charlotte, his expression shifted instantly. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "Are you all right?" Charlotte offered a faint, unreadable smile. "I'm perfectly fine." The experience was enlightening. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He turned sharply toward the investigator, then toward the waiting airline officials. "Take them." Jessica flinched. Two uniformed officers stepped forward immediately, stopping directly in front of her seat. "Ms. Langley," one of them said, voice clipped, "you need to come with us." Jessica's breath hitched. "Wait, what?" "You are being detained for formal questioning regarding allegations of discriminatory conduct, abuse of position, and violation of corporate ethics policies," the officer continued, his expression unreadable. "Refusal to comply may result in immediate legal action." Jessica's body locked up. No, this isn't happening. I was just doing my job." The officer remained completely unmoved. "You can explain that during the investigation." Passengers had begun to slow their exit, turning back to watch the scene unfold. The same people who had laughed with Jessica, who had delighted in Charlotte's humiliation, now watched in horrified silence as their ringleader fell. Jessica turned wildly toward Charles. "Mr. Whitmore, say something. You saw. I didn't do anything wrong." Charles said nothing. Jessica's face contorted in disbelief. You agreed with me. You encouraged it." Charles finally looked at her. But his expression wasn't one of concern. It was disgust, as if he couldn't believe she had been stupid enough to involve him in this. Jessica's breathing turned erratic. "This isn't fair. I've worked for this company for 10 years. This is my career." Charlotte watched in silence. She didn't need to say a word. Jessica had already lost. The officers pulled her to her feet. As she was escorted out, the entire first-class cabin remained utterly still. Then, the next name was called. "Mr. Whitmore." Charles's jaw tensed, but he remained seated, not acknowledging the investigator standing in front of him. "Sir, as previously stated, your elite status with the airline has been permanently revoked," the investigator continued. "Furthermore, we have launched an internal investigation into multiple prior complaints regarding your conduct toward both passengers and airline staff." Charles's fingers curled into fists. "I have done nothing illegal," he finally said, his voice low and controlled. "No," the investigator agreed. "But the companies you serve as a board member may not see it that way once this report reaches them." A flicker of something crossed Charles's face. That was the real blow. Not the flight, not the humiliation, but the realization that this wasn't just an inconvenience. This was going to ruin him. Charlotte walked past him without another glance. Outside the gate, the scene was even bigger than expected. A cluster of journalists had already gathered, cameras flashing, murmurs of curiosity rippling through the crowd. Airport staff whispered among themselves, glancing at the scene unfolding just beyond the glass. Liam Carter stepped out beside Charlotte, slipping his journal into his bag. "Well," he said, exhaling sharply. "That was satisfying." Charlotte hummed in mild amusement. "Don't get me wrong," Liam continued, grinning slightly now. "I was going to write about this either way. But I have to admit, watching it play out in real time was..." He gave a low whistle. "Brutal." Charlotte cast him a sideways glance. "And yet, you let it happen." Liam didn't look away. "Would you have wanted me to intervene?" She considered the question. "No," she admitted after a pause. "Because that wasn't the point." Charlotte hadn't needed saving. She had just needed them to show their true colors. And they had. Jonathan approached her again, expression unreadable. "What would you like to do now?" Charlotte glanced at the reporters gathering nearby. Then, at the two ruined people being escorted toward security. Jessica was still pleading, crying, grasping for anyone who would listen. Charles walked stiffly beside her, his expression dark and unreadable. The people who had once felt untouchable had been reduced to nothing. Charlotte exhaled slowly, feeling the last remnants of tension ease from her shoulders. She turned to Jonathan. "We make sure this never happens again." Jonathan nodded, already prepared to follow her lead. The journalists finally noticed her, cameras flashing, voices rising with questions. Charlotte walked forward, meeting them head-on. She had been silent long enough. It was time to speak. The end. What do you think? Did the punishment fit the crime, or should it have gone even further? If you were in Charlotte's place, what would you have done differently? Comment your thoughts below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you love stories of power, revenge, and the downfall of those who think they're untouchable, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there's always another story waiting to be told.